Bibles here and to chapter 1. Nehemiah chapter 1. And beginning to read at verse 1, please, of the chapter. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass in the month Chislev, that in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan palace, that Hananiah, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also was broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him, and observe his commandments, let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee day and night for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee, both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments, which thou commandest thy servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you among the nations. But if ye turn to me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now, these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power, and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name. And prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. We'll enter at the end of the chapter, verse 11. We know the Lord will bless again the reading of his word to your hearts today. You know, the book of Nehemiah shows us the impact that one man can have in the society that he lives in. That one man can have in the nation that he lives in. The last time we were here, we were looking again at Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah was serving in the court of the Persian king Artaxerxes, and he was a cupbearer. He was a man who stood between the king and the public as far as food was concerned. He would have tasted that food or tasted the wine that the king was given to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. He was responsible for preserving the life of the king. He was born in exile. Many of the Jews returned home to Jerusalem, but Nehemiah stayed on. His brother Hananiah, we read, came back from a trip to Jerusalem and shared the news with him of what was happening there. And we saw, the last time I was here, the question that Nehemiah asked. He asked, what about the Jews? What about the people? What about Jerusalem? He was a man who was concerned with the people first, wasn't he? And we shared about that. And then the place of Jerusalem after that. We also saw from the last time the information that Nehemiah received. We realized that Hananiah was a faithful man, and he feared God. And the message that came through from the messenger was that there was a people in desolation, and there was a place that was in devastation. The walls were broken down. The gates were burned with fire. The place was a mess. This morning we're going to look at just a couple of other things here as we think of this chapter, especially from verse 4. We're going to see the reaction that Nehemiah showed, and also the intercession that Nehemiah offered here from verse 4. And there's much significance in this prayer for us today. Verse 4 says, and it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. We see the reaction of this man as he heard the news of this needy situation in his land. in the life of the people there, and in the life of his native city. He sits down and he weeps, and he mourns, and he prays, and he fasts. Certain day. This is a better policy than some of the ones that we have entered into in a time of national upheaval in our land. And certainly as we look at our nation at the minute, and look at the state of our own province at the minute, what we need is prayer. What we need is a move of God again. Isn't it far better to go to God in prayer than going to men? At least whenever we go to God, we get profitable answers. More than we get from some men. Psalm 118 verse 8 says, "It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man." And I don't go into politics or talk about politics, especially from the pulpit, but so often today, the politicians are knocking our doors, aren't they? And they're trying to canvass to get votes. And they promise you everything as you talk to them on the doors. And so often their promises fail, don't they? Because they're just men. They fail. We put far too much confidence in what man can do so often, rather than looking to God and what God can do. And Ulster needs to take a leaf out of Nehemiah's book, because we are a nation today that's in a critical situation. Just like the nation of Jerusalem then. Just like the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah went to the only one who could help. And that was God. How did Nehemiah react to the information he received from Hananiah's brother? Well, we see first of all that he reacted in contemplation. It tells us there in verse 4 that he sat down. It was customary for Jews to sit whenever they mourned, and so Nehemiah was imitating the grieving Jewish captives who had been exiled to Babylon years before. We need to visualize Nehemiah here. We need to see him in that beautiful surrounding of the Persian king's palace. And there he would have to try and find a place away from all the palace activity to be alone, to sit down, to meditate, to contemplate the situation that he just heard about from his brother, about the state of Jerusalem and the reproach of those who he loved, his people. And like Daniel, Nehemiah would maybe have had his own private room somewhere where he could have gone, where he could have gone down and prayed to God and faced towards Jerusalem, but we don't know that, it doesn't tell us that. But he would have to go and find a place that he could be still. His own people, the Jews, were being reproached. They believed in the true and living God. Some of them had already gone back to rebuild the temple, to introduce the worship of Jehovah again in Jerusalem, but progress was very slow. There were those who taunted them, saying, if your God is the true God, why is he not doing more for us, more for you, than what he's doing? But Nehemiah found time in the midst of the busy program that he had to contemplate what is needed for the city. One of the problems that I face today, and one of the problems that I'm sure we all face today, is that so often we don't have time to sit down and to really contemplate our work and our witness for God. Time for everything, and we have time for everyone, but so often we don't have real time to sit down and to contemplate who he is, what he has done, what he can do. Do we ever sit still for a wee moment and think about the desperate need in our world? Do we ever take time to stop from the busyness of life and look around and see the need in our own wee country? As I said, the rat race that we live in, the busyness of life so often, and in Christian work, it's the same. It's so difficult sometimes because we're so busy, and you're running from here to there to yonder, and just taking time out and taking time to stop, to look around us and to see the need, and then to look up to the one who can meet the need, who can minister to hearts and who can change lives. We're very guilty of that, aren't we, as a people of God so often. John George Govan is the man who founded the work of the Faith Mission. He was a Glasgow businessman, very well-to-do businessman. He had all the world at his fingertips. He took time to sit by the Firth of Clyde. And as he sat there, he was watching in the hills above Coleraine, he was watching the pleasure boats as they were bobbing about in the water in the big ship. And as he looked out at the sea in front of him, those pleasure boats reminded him of people, reminded him of those who were heedless and careless. And he contemplated the needs of the villages and the rural parts of Scotland. People that had really not heard the gospel message. On October 1886, he wrote in his diary, the Faith Mission started. Stepping out in faith and trusting God to meet the needs, to call others to come and to help them in the great work of evangelizing Scotland for Christ. And of course that work spread down through the years. He took a moment to look to the one who could meet the needs. And of course for all of these years God has met the needs of the Faith Mission. What a wonderful testimony and story that is, to see what God has done through that. And thousands and tens of thousands of souls have come to Christ because of the vision of one man who took time to stop and to be still and to see what God could do. John George Govan said this: if the Faith Mission ceases to be a soul-saving agency, it doesn't deserve to exist. And isn't that so true? Out of a moment of contemplation was born a mission that would reach to the villages of Scotland and the rural parts of Scotland and England and Northern Ireland and Wales and further across the world, as God took the mission to Japan, as God took the mission to Canada, and God is still working in those places today. And the work has continued to grow and continue to see souls come to the Lord. The vision of one man who took time. What would happen if God's people would just sit down for a moment in contemplation once again? For to sit for a moment and look behind us, that housing estate. I know you probably think every time he comes here he's always barging, isn't that right? But that's the vision of my soul and my heart. To reach a world that is lost. As we look down the Ballycastle Road, we see people that are heedless and careless today. You see them driving past here, walking past here. They have no thought of God. They have no time for God. We need to stop as a people of God just for a moment. We can never do the work that God wants us to do until He has opened our eyes, until we see things as they really are today. Until we see souls around us that are perishing without a Saviour, that are going to a Christless hell. Oh, that God would open our hearts and our eyes yet again for a world that's lost. Someone said before we should attempt any service for God, we should get alone with God on our knees and mourn over the human heart. William Carey, who was that known as the father of modern missions, he was a cobbler. And he had a map on the wall of his shop, made out of leather. And each day as he looked at that map, he quietly contemplated the need of the world. And God touched his heart, and God sent him to India. And he laboured there for 7 years before he saw his first convert. He made a powerful statement, and we hear it quoted so often today, don't we? Attempt great things for God. And expect great things from God. And folks, as a church, as a people here today, that's what we need to do, isn't it? We need to take our eyes sometimes on the situation that we're in. We need to put our eyes on Him. We need to attempt great things for God. And then expect greater things from God. Because we have a God who nothing is impossible to, who no one is impossible to. You know, we live in a world that only thinks about sin and pleasure, don't we? believers, so often the same spirit has gripped us and has gripped our nation and is crumbling away at our feet. Someone said that Scotland used to be the land of the book. It's now the land of the booze, the bookies, and the bingo. That's what they say today. We've got away so far from the things of God. We live in a nation of pagans instead of a nation of believers. We need to be like Nehemiah. We need to take time to be still, to look to him, to trust him, to believe him. Nehemiah reacted in contemplation. But we also see that he also reacted in emotion. It tells us there in verse 4 that he sat down. He took time to be still out of the business of the routine of the past. And that he wept. Emotion can be motivated by men, but here is an emotion that is born out of a heart of burden and a heart of concern for a people who were in desperation. If faith is not accompanied by feelings, someone said it is spurious and suspect. The person who says they have faith and no feelings or no burden for the souls of dying men and women, it must be suspect. The Apostle Paul could say, my heart's desire for Israel is that they might be saved. Someone has said that those who have no concern for their own kith and kin could not possibly be saved. Sometimes weeping is a sign of weakness, isn't it? Or we think that weeping is a sign of weakness. But with Nehemiah, it was a sign of strength. He willingly shared the burden that was crushing others. God placed that burden on his heart. And whenever God places a burden on our hearts, we shouldn't try to escape it or get away from it, for if we do, we might just miss out on the blessing that God has for us. Again, someone said, our tears water the seeds of providence that God has planted on our path. And without those tears, the seeds could never grow and produce fruit. We looked at that a wee while ago, didn't we, in Psalm 126. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing. The Lord Jesus wept. He wept over Jerusalem. But so often we have lost the ability to weep, haven't we? We can't imagine Fanny Crosby as she penned the words, and I'm sure her heart breaking as she penned the words, rescue the perishing. Care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave, weep o'er the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty Savior. I'm sure for all of us as parents here, we've wept over our children, wept over our family. It's too late weeping when they're gone, isn't it? The hour is too late to be playing around with trivial things. So often we're caught up in the insignificant, aren't we? And caught up in things that really don't matter. And the devil wants to blur our vision for a world that's lost. He wants to blur our burden for souls. And we get caught up in so many things. And I know this church so well, but in so many churches we get caught up in doctrinal issues, things that are of lesser importance. And people will fight over the silliest of things. And they forget that there's souls out there that are lost. I was in a church a few years ago, and the pastor was telling me of the church that there was a big fight going on over the flowers at the front. The flowers lovely? That's how it is. I think, yeah. Liz didn't tell me this, by the way, so it's alright. There was a big fight going on in the church because the flowers weren't sitting on the communion table like these ones are here today. They were sitting on the corner. And there was a whole row went on, and a fight went on, and they were really going to take the people to court who moved them over the head of it all. It was Children's Day, and they couldn't have them sitting where they were sitting, and this fight went on. And it happened to be in another church, and I used it as an illustration one day. And the minute the pastor came to me afterwards, he says, "You're never going to believe this." He said, "But you hit the nail on the head today." I said, "Why? What did I say?" What was said wrong? He said, "You know, you talked about those flowers in the other church." He says, "There's a row going on here over flowers too." And I said, "The Lord help us. If we get so caught up in these trivial, stupid things that mean absolutely nothing, there's people around us trampling their way in lost eternity." And again, we could talk about so many things, couldn't we? On important issues that we so often get caught up in, the devil wants to blur our vision with. The hour is dark to be fooling around, isn't it? The hymn writer says, "There's a call comes ringing over the restless wave. Send the light, send the light. There are souls to rescue, there are souls to save. Send the light, send the light." Paul the Apostle in Acts 20 verse 19 speaks about many tears. In Acts 20:31 he said, "I cease not to warn everyone night and day with tears." To Corinthians 2:4, "I wrote unto you with many tears." In 2 Timothy 14 is speaking about Timothy's tears. Sangster, the well-known preacher, said, "The man who screams at a football match was distressed whenever he sees sinners weep at the cross and murmurs about the dangers of emotionalism hardly merits intelligent respect." Murray McShane was that well-known preacher who died when he was just a young man. I've been at his church in Dundee, St. Peter's Church in Dundee, and there was a visitor there one time who asked the caretaker of the church, he said, "Can you tell me the secret of Murray McShane's ministry?" And he took him to the vestry and he said, "Put your hands on your head, now let the tears flow." And then he took him up into the pulpit and he said to him, "Put your hands on your head and let the tears flow." He said, "That's the secret of Murray McShane's ministry here in this place." The Lord has challenged me as I prepared this. When's the last time I wept for souls? When's the last time I wept over souls going to a lost eternity? When's the last time I really wept over the state of our province and our world today? Nehemiah wasn't afraid to weep. He sat down and he wept. He knew that someone had to do something to rescue Jerusalem, and he was willing to do whatever it was, whatever it would cost, he was willing to do it. Folks, we need to cry to God for him to do something in our nation today. I don't need to tell you that here. We need to cry out to God to move, because we're in such a state of it. And it's lovely to hear what God is doing across our province these days. So encouraged, John Weir, who's coming here next year for the mission. John has been doing a mission in Kilkeel. They had to make the tent bigger and bigger and bigger with the crowds that were coming. The tent now held last Sunday night between 12 and 1,300 people. There was standing room only. Wonderful to hear of souls coming to know Christ as their Saviour. We're not hearing as much of that today, are we? But souls getting saved. And I know the prayer meetings were something else in that mission as people cried out to God to move. Ballykeel Baptist Church, which is not far from where we live, have had a week, it was extended to nearly 2 weeks of mission, and a tent mission there, with Roger Carswell, who's an evangelist from England. And it's called Real Lives, and each night they just had people sharing their life stories. Wonderful to hear of souls come to Christ. Friends of ours who go to the church, they said to us the prayer meetings are something else. As people cry out to God to save their families and save their friends, save their neighbours. We need God to move in our nation today. He reacted in contemplation, he reacted in emotion, he reacted in lamentation. We read that Nehemiah not only sat down, but he wept, but that he mourned. The word translated here means that sometimes he cried out with cries of anguish. He lamented. He mourned. He screamed out in desperation. The psalmist in Psalm 129, verse 126 says, "It is time for thee, Lord, to work, for the main void thy law." His grief overcame him. Have we ever been there? Not a public exhibition, but before God in prayer. He didn't display it, but he did it before God. The one who sees in secret, and the one who rewards openly. Does God expect us to do more than what we're doing? No use just talking about it, is it? And saying we can't do much more, or how will we ever do that? Or what have we got to offer to the society that we live in? Do we just accept things the way that they are? Elizabeth Elliot, who was the widow of Jim Elliot, who was killed by the Aka Indians many years ago, she wrote these words: "Save us from the weary acceptance of things as they are." We're not to get used to the way that things as they are. We want to see God move, don't we? He was in a state of lamenting, of mourning. His heart was broken. Broken for the conditions of the world that he lived in. Very quickly, as time's gone, he reacted also in humiliation. It tells us there that he fasted. The Old Testament context, fasting was a sign of deep humiliation, an exercise of humiliation and godly sorrow. Nehemiah knew that the only thing he could do was to humble himself before God and break his heart in God's presence for the needs of the people. He must be prepared for this if he wants to see God work and move and intervene. He reacted in supplication. He prayed before the God of heaven. And what an example Nehemiah has set for us as we face the crises in our nation today. As we face the crisis in our world today. Man going God's way to solve the crisis, not man going man's way. You see, Nehemiah was a man who lived near to God. A man who trusted in God. He was moved by a people of desolation. He was moved by a city that was desolate. There was a desperation. He lamented. He humbled himself before God. And he supplicated before the throne of grace in prayer for others. Prayer is a power that is more potent, more powerful than all the nuclear weapons that this world has. And so often we're not using it the way we should. And I have to say, folks, whenever I've been in the prayer meeting in this church, I remember the first time that I came, and I got out after the prayer meeting, and I rang Karen, and I said, "Karen, my heart has been blessed today." I have to say that. I'm so glad that the folk come to pray here, and certainly the spirit of prayer, it blesses my heart. I have to say that today. Somebody said, "Don't let our intercessions die while the intercessor lives." He lives to make intercession for us, the one who's seated at the right hand of God the Father. You know, prayer is not the least we can do, folks. It's the most, isn't it? And I quite often see people and visit people and they say, "I can't go to meetings anymore. I can't do this anymore. I can't do that anymore. I just pray." And I say, that's the most important thing we can do, is to pray. Interceding on behalf of others. What a tremendous privilege that is, to be able to do that. You know, men spurn our appeals, and they reject our message, and they oppose our arguments, but they're helpless against our prayers. Will you remember that? Men spurn our appeals, reject our message, oppose our arguments, but they're helpless against our prayers. Maybe there's someone you've tried to witness to, you've tried to invite to church, maybe someone you've been trying to reach for years, maybe someone in your family, and you think they're impossible. They're helpless against your prayers. What a weapon we have. You know, most of our prayers are just asking God to bless our family, bless the work, bless the folks who are sick, to keep plugging along. Isn't that right? Alan Redpath says, prayer is not merely prattle. Prayer is warfare. Real prayer engages in the battle. Real prayer is rooted in the promises of God and the covenant of the blood. And this challenge to me, how long do I spend in time in prayer? As I look some mornings into the busyness of the day and what has to happen and what has to do, sometimes it's not very long sometimes. Instead of taking time aside, spending time with God. If our hearts were prepared, then God would bless us even in the worst of days. The prayer meeting is the worst attended meeting so often in the church, isn't it? They call it the Cinderella of the church. And of course we're involved in bigger churches, smaller churches, and sometimes in the bigger churches, there's so few come to the prayer meetings to pray. So often we don't have that desire to pray. So often we sing that we're in love with the Lord, but we never speak to Him. Isn't that true? You know, whenever someone falls in love and they start to go out together, and some of you all have been there, I'm sure most of you. Whenever you fall in love with someone, you start to go out together, you talk to them, don't you? And years ago, we were on the phone with them. Maybe not in the days of mobile phones way back then, but quite often now they're never off the phones, isn't that right? Back and forward. They're talking to each other. They're finding out about each other. Wesley said that God does nothing but an answer to prayer. Spurgeon said, we will never see much change for the better in our churches in general until we see the prayer meeting occupying a higher place in the esteem of believers. Nehemiah was faithful as he interceded on behalf of people, as he interceded on behalf of the place of Jerusalem. And he prayed for 4 months before God answered. Abraham prayed. Elijah prayed and the fire fell. Daniel prayed and the lions' mouths were shut. Paul prayed and the prison was shaken. Luther prayed and the Church of Rome was shaken. Wesley prayed and revival came. Evan Roberts prayed and wheels knew a move of God. Just one man. 4 lads in tails in a little old schoolhouse prayed. And God moved in a mighty way in our province. 2 old ladies in the Highlands of Scotland prayed. And God moved in revival in the Hebrides. Whenever I first went to Shetland Islands, one of the islands off Shetland is an island called Burra Island. And there's a little Baptist church on it. And way back, well over 100 years ago, there were 2 faith mission lady pilgrims who were missioning up around Shetland. And in the middle of the winter time, there was no bridges like there are today across the islands to get to Burra. You had to get a fishing boat, a little boat from the Scalloway harbour across rough seas to get there. And those 2 pilgrims went there and they were staying with a little old lady in her home, a little believer. And they said to her, you know, it'll be worth it all here on this island if one soul gets saved. And the woman looked at them and said, 1 soul? Is that all you're asking God for? She said, I've been praying that God will save 101 souls. Folks, exactly 101 souls were saved. God knew. And answered prayer. Nehemiah contemplated, he wept. He sat down, he wept, he lamented, he mourned, he humbled himself, he supplicated on behalf of others. God's still looking for a people who will care. God's still looking to each of us as believers today for people like Nehemiah, who cared enough to ask for the facts, who cared enough to weep over the needs, who cared enough to pray for God's help, and to volunteer to get the job wonder as we finish this morning, time's marched on, sorry, you know we live by now, don't you? Somebody said I don't go by the clock, I go by the calendar. I wonder this morning what we say as we look out at the state of our land, as we look at the Ballycastle Road, as we look at Harper's Hill behind us and further afield in this town of Coleraine. I wonder what we say, Lord, as we think of the state of our land, what we say, Lord, here am I. Send me. Use me in some small way.